It's such a privilege to be the first presenter of this conference, during which you will hear from experts of pornography, which I am not. So my role here is to give you a brief, very brief overview of why porn and prostitution are harmful cultural practices that share origins, history, and impact. And again, we couldn't do this work without Culture Reframed and everyone who has joined us. We are a global movement, and we are primarily a legal advocacy organization, but we work with the global and growing survivor-led movement to change laws and change cultures. So first and foremost, I wanted to say we are on a 5,000-year journey on which we are collectively walking to ending cultures of sexual violence and discrimination. The story of prostitution and pornography is the story of patriarchy. I only have 20 minutes to give you a historical overview.
I apologize, Taina. May I just interrupt for one moment?
Yes.
Our Italian interpreters need to unmute. I believe that no one heard the message about putting IT in front of their name, and the Italian interpretation is currently not working. So if the Italian interpreter and the Turkish interpreters just make sure they're unmuted when it's their turn to speak. Apologies for the interruption. I want to make sure that can we get confirmation that someone is able to hear what I'm saying in Italian before we continue? I don't want to have anyone miss your message. Okay. Juliana says that she is working, so let's see. Someone says she's been interpreting for 20 minutes. Several people are saying they cannot hear the Italian interpretation. So let's see. We're testing right now. Was anyone else able to hear this in Italian? Again, to choose the Italian interpretation, you're going to click on the interpretation button on the bottom right of Zoom. Apologies, Tanya, for interrupting you just the beginning.
No. I
saw the confusion in chat.
I thought I was doing something wrong. So
no, you're fine. Okay. So Juliana, our interpreter is just checking. So all folks who want to do interpretation, please click on the interpretation button on the bottom right of Zoom. Let's see. I'm going to type. Could someone write that in Italian? Oh, someone's telling me that they pressed the Italian button, but they cannot hear. We tested this at the beginning. I'm going to switch over to that language. Juliana, if you interpret me, I'll be able to hear you.
Yes, I'm interpreting into Italian. This is Italian channel. Can you hear me?
Okay, so I am hearing that. I just listened in Italian and we can hear it. Okay, now we're able to hear. I'm not sure what just happened, but let's continue. Thank you, Taina, very much for your patience. Everyone, thank you very much for your patience as well.
And thank you for the interpreters. And I apologize in advance for speaking very fast. But again, we're limited in time, and I'm always happy to speak with anyone who's further interested on these issues after the conference. So this presentation will briefly talk on 3 points: the origins of terminology and how language shapes our views on violence against women and girls, the importance of human rights principle and international law in our work, and the journey on which we are all on to shrink and eradicate the sex trade and ending commercial sexual exploitation, which obviously includes prostitution and pornography. And again, this is a cultural journey. I focus here on women and girls because I am first and foremost a women's rights activist. Sex inequality and gender-based violence and discrimination are prisms through which I see the world and my work. And secondly, when discussing sexual exploitation as a harmful cultural practice, it's important to explain what we mean by that. So prior to 1993, when the term women's rights are human rights were coined at a UN conference in Vienna, anything that happened to girls and women because they were born female, whether it was female genital mutilation, girl marriage, polygamy, domestic violence, sexual harassment, rape, prostitution, the list goes on, were all just considered life.
İstismardan korunmasına dair bir takım anlaşmalar ortaya.
Tradition, Prostitution and pornography are not exceptions to that violence and discrimination and negative sex and gender stereotypes and sex inequality. I also wanted to note that there are also men, boys, trans and gender nonconforming people who are bought, sold, prostituted, sexually exploited, and pornified. They are generally also highly feminized bodies, and therefore we are also talking about gender-based inequality and discrimination. Let's talk about language, the origins of sex work and how language shapes our
Seks işçiliğinin kökenine bakacak olursak, bu konudaki terminoloji
about the system of patriarchy. It is a main pillar of male supremacy. No one really knows how the patriarchy really took hold, whether it was the division of labor or the sheer exercise of physical force. We believe it happened 5,000 years ago. Here we see a representation of the sale and prostitution of women in Mesopotamia, whose Hammurabi Code still permeates our laws globally. I won't focus here on the origins of patriarchy in China and other parts of Asia or in Africa, but it's clear that although the industrial age and the rise of capitalism fortified the commodification and made women profit centers, patriarchy exists and thrives without capitalism. So you will hear from speakers throughout this conference about how pornography permeates every aspect of our respective cultures. It influences the arts and media we consume. It stands in for sex education. It shapes the language we use to characterize women and each other. It normalizes sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and dehumanization, and it is tragically seen as forms of erotic expression and free speech, especially here in this country, in the United States. From a language perspective, it's interesting to look at the origin. So erotica stems from the Roman god of love, Eros.
Erotica viene dal dio romano dell'amore Eros. Pornografia in antico greco comprende porn, che è una schiava femminile nella prostituzione, graphine, che è la rappresentazione. Queste sono due rappresentazioni della prostituzione sulle pareti dei bordelli, molte immagini di pornografia in diversi edifici e ville, i retri delle case nella storia, che mostrano che la pornografia è la rappresentazione della prostituzione e dello sfruttamento sessuale che sono presenti da tantissimo tempo. Non si può parlare del commercio del sesso oggi senza tornare in...
While prostitution and the sex trade were thriving in Europe for a very long time, it is through colonization that every country that the colonizers invaded brought with them the system of prostitution. It is the first thing that Christopher Columbus did when he landed on Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He prostituted, raped, sexually exploited the Taino Indian women, and this is the case in many, many countries. It's very interesting to read the legislative histories of many of the criminal codes, whether it's South Africa, Canada, Hawaii, where they specifically talk about certain captains, whether it's James Cook or others, who brought with them the system of prostitution. So porn or art, this is a question that has been plaguing society for a very long time, or is it sexual exploitation or work? These are just three illustrations. We know the Marquis de Sade, the 19th century French aristocrat known for his pornographic fiction, who was jailed for a number of alleged crimes, including whipping and drugging women in prostitution. Amerigo Vespucci, whose name America comes from, who was a slave trader who sexualized the indigenous women, raped and prostituted them. And another example is Sarche Bartman, known as the Hottentot Venus, who was sold by slave traders in Cape Town, South Africa, and was sold into the salons of France and London. What's interesting to note here is, we are in the middle of the European Age of Enlightenment, which enriched the world with revolutionary ideas about individual liberty, progress, tolerance, and constitutional government. And at the same time, those progressive thinkers developed rationales for colonialism, prostitution, pornography, and enslaving millions of people. Again, now we hear in our current media and elsewhere the same rationales to accept the sex trade as normal, as culturally normal. This is just another example. Women of African descent in this country and across the Americas were among the most profitable assets during slavery, colonialism, and patriarchy on steroids. We are talking about state-sanctioned profits from the rapes, prostitution, pornography, and sex trafficking of women. This, again, is just an example in the US, but we can talk about Asian women in sex tourism spots for US military during the Vietnam War, Indigenous women across the Americas, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands. And the impact of that today can be found in prostitution statistics. So, for example, while Black women and girls comprise 6% of the US population, in certain jurisdictions, they represent over 50% of prostituted individuals. Similarly, Indigenous women can comprise anywhere between 1% to 2% of local population, and yet they can account for 70% in some localities of those who are prostituted. Again, these numbers can be found in other parts of the world. So language, as we know from Culture Reframed, is very, very important. It legitimizes harmful cultural practices. The term quote unquote sex work is a euphemism for the sex trade in its entirety. It sanitizes the brutalities of prostitution. The goal of it was to mainstream it, to make sexual exploitation seem as a sport, entertainment. And it is, unfortunately now it is a ubiquitous term, but the people who do use the term, advocates and others who do use the term sex work, are generally individuals who promote the legalization or decriminalization of the sex trade. What's important to notice that it's a term that comes directly from the sex trade itself. Margot St. James, the founder of Coyote, was arrested and convicted of running a brothel, which is pimping. And they also coined the term sex positivity, which many people forget. And so this is a term that is now used by teens and young women and everyone else to camouflage sexual practices that are harmful to body and mind and community, and is also embraced as conforming to our current societal roles. So when we do our work, we are not inventing anything. We want to guide our work on human rights principles and international law. I always bring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gives us and governments around the world the concept of dignity and worth of the person, that everyone has a right to live a life free from violence and discrimination. And also what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has done is inspire myriad international covenants, which also bring up the concept of dignity and equality of the person. In particular, the 1949 Convention, which the US has not ratified, talks about prostitution and traffic as incompatible with the dignity and worth. You see that language also in the CEDAW Convention, which is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which the US has also not ratified. And here you see the CEDAW Committee in 1992 talking about traditional attitudes that relegate women as subordinate human beings, as second-class citizens, and that those attitudes contribute to the propagation of pornography. And as we know, once you dehumanize a human being, anything can be done to that human being. So here we are talking about the tug and pull between systems of accountability and the global sex trade that keeps reinventing itself into our cultures, through academia, the arts, media, and politics. So briefly, I'm running out of time, but it's important to look at the Palermo Protocol, which gives us the international agreed upon definition of human trafficking, and also talks about the exploitation of prostitution as also incompatible with the dignity and worth of the human being. It also links sex trafficking to the sex trade. What is very important is consent to one's exploitation is always irrelevant. That is also a human rights principle. And thankfully, the United States did ratify the Palermo Protocol, which means that they and every government that has ratified the Palermo Protocol has an obligation to enact laws that target the demand for prostitution that contributes to sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. So why are these gendered crimes? The UN, this is the UN Office for Drugs and Crimes, says it all. 72% of all detected human trafficking victims are women and girls. 94% of detected sex trafficking victims are women and girls. And a very sad statistic that was recently reported is that girls are the fastest group of detected trafficking victims at 23% versus 7% boys. Every country in the world has that percentage applied to it. Okay, so what is our journey? The journey, while laws are key in combating sexual exploitation, we cannot legislate or incarcerate ourselves out of this mess. What needs to change is the culture. And to do so, we have to remember that it is about language and raising awareness. That is our call. So a historical arc of pornography, sexual violence, and sexual exploitation is not only cultural, but it's also part of the economy. Here, just two illustrations among myriad. A Jezebel was the stereotypical name used for Black women sold into prostitution during, antebellum and post emancipation. These nutcrackers are available on Etsy if anyone would be interested in purchasing them. And here I just thought it was an interesting comparison to see sort of the utmost objectification and violence against women that is so normalized. Too many images we could share from we don't have time to share. We could have a whole months-long course on how, from the advertising mega agencies of Madison Avenue to Hollywood, the sex trade, which we know is a large swath of establishments, from street prostitution to strip clubs, escorting, pornography, online sugar dating, et cetera. They are far too normalized in our daily lives for us to see the abuse and devastation it inflicts on those bought and sold in it. What strikes me when we advocate on these issues, whether it's with policymakers, legislators, media, is really the lack of empathy that they show for women, girls, and others who are in prostitution and pornography. Very often the issue of choice and agency come up a lot, and we have to remember that these are also arguments that were used for 5,000 years when advocates and feminists were trying to get governments to recognize domestic violence, like sexual violence, rape, as crimes of abuse of power, of violence against women. We have succeeded in that, and therefore we will hope to succeed also in prostitution and pornography. And this sort of cultural acceptance of sexual exploitation spills over into philanthropy and human rights and civil rights organizations that should recognize that prostitution and pornography are not exceptions to violence. And I just have to note, because this is an evergreen offense to Kenneth Roth, is the executive director of human rights watch. And as you can see here, he believes that poor women should be allowed the opportunity to enter into the sex trade on a voluntary basis. Here are the most famous sex buyers, pornographers, especially R. Kelly and Epstein. There are many, many more men. The good news, especially with these particular men, is that accountability has begun. I just wanted to note a quote from a so-called porn star, Natasha Kiss, on Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who is this man here. And it says that Dominique does not need to rape a woman. If he wants, he can just pay an escort or do as he did in Paris and go to a private club to enjoy himself. We also have to, although we do celebrate to some level that some accountability is being recorded, it's extremely relative. Like, for instance, if you look at the testimonies around Jeffrey Epstein, he apparently demanded up to 3 or more sexual acts a day, minimum of 3 orgasms a day with women and girls. If that is true, it would mean that that would be 1,068 acts of sexual violence a year. And over the last 3 or 4 decades of Epstein's patterns of sexual abuse, which, by the way, maybe his abuse was not recorded, but certainly all his friends who went to the Lolita Island, his private islands, they were all recorded, right? So again, pornography is included in that. So going back to the calculation, let's say that he was abusing women and girls for 30, 40 years. We are talking 32,000 instances of rape and sexual assault. Only 4 victims were able to go to court in the Ghislaine Maxwell case. Ghislaine Maxwell was the pimp who worked with Jeffrey Epstein. I don't have time to go into the economics of this sexual exploitation, but obviously this is enormous money. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women presented just issued a report on sex buyers in New York State. People think that they are invisible. They are not. They tell you very clearly that they objectify, commodify, pornify women. They rate them online like they were pieces of meat in a marketplace. The ILO estimates that, and this is an extremely conservative statistics for reasons I won't go into, that the annual money coming from sex trafficking is $90 billion a year. That is probably quadruple the amount, but what people rarely say is that every single one of those dollars come from sex buyers. So I would like to leave you with a little hope and a few tools to ensure that we continue this road toward equality. As I've tried to show you in 2 seconds, it's a long journey ahead of us because there are thousands of years of sociocultural and economic patterns of sexual exploitation. But we do have new tools at our hands that we didn't have 30 years ago. We continue raising awareness, like this wonderful conference. Legal advocacy is key. The media is massive. The media is very, very pro-sex trade. I think outreach to medical community is really key because until we understand the harms of prostitution, pornography, and sexual exploitation, we will not understand the devastation it causes. So we need to think about the harms of smoking and tuberculosis and female genital mutilation. And we need to ensure that our medical institutions, whether it's National Institute of Health or the Centers for Disease Control, really look into this situation. The Me Too movement is key. Obviously, it was really a catalyst to starting to have these conversations. Unfortunately, it did not spill over into pornography and prostitution as much as we wanted to. I always like to quote survivor leader Autumn Burris, who says prostitution is Me Too on steroids. And also, first and foremost, it is key to work with survivor leaders. They are essential to our understanding of the harms of prostitution and also give us hope into how we can tackle it from a human rights violation perspective. And with that, I thank you.